It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, part of ISSI, and and my name is Charles Briggs. I'm along with Seth Holmes, who couldn't be here today, the co-director, and I'm asked to remind you that we have another event coming up soon where a member of the center, Claudia Montini Briggs, will be giving a talk on the 8th of November from 4 to 5:30, Chronic Cultural Impossibility, Ideologies that Undermine Health as a Fundamental Social Right. So please come back then. I thank the co-sponsors, which actually gives you some sense of the coalitions that are beginning to form around the speaker. This is co-sponsored by the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management here at Berkeley, and of course by the joint PhD program in Medical Anthropology with UCSF. And as always, it's wonderful to have so many folks from the San Francisco part of our program here. I'm also asked to tell you to turn off any devices that will make lots of noise in the middle of a talk, which I think is always a great idea. It is wonderful to be able to introduce my newest colleague, Sarah Vaughn. And to be able to introduce her, before coming to Berkeley, she was the James and Mary Pinchot Sustainability Fellow at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale. And before that, she was a provost postdoctoral scholar in anthro at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD not from any of those institutions, but from Columbia University. Her work has been supported by one of the prized Mellon ACLS fellowships and by Woodrow Wilson Foundation Mellon Hayes grant. She won the Elsie Clues Parsons Student Paper Prize from the American Ethnological Society. Her dissertation involved 17 months of research in coastal Guyana. Her work draws attention to how citizens must take on a climate adaptation mindset in order to survive in post-disaster Guyana. She traces sensitively the way the shift represents a change in register between languages of corruption and individual property rights to domains of techno-science. She emphasizes how what she refers to as a politics of vulnerability, which she suggests become a resource that informs both governmental measures and the locus of participatory techno-science and claims to citizenship. By claiming to become experts in managing climate-related risks through climatic speech acts, I love that phrase, and participation in projects, some citizens become more vulnerable than others. In a wonderful article published in Critique of Anthropology, Dr. Vaughn criticizes how environmental disaster becomes legible as a national failure of neoliberal knowledge, thus requiring neoliberal interventions in order to manage techno-scientific details. She traces the unsustainable techno-solution to this problem as it emerges, in her words, through the creation of an expert citizen who is necessary for the production of expertise about floods. Very timely formulations in our particular day and age. A figure that encodes, in Stuart Hall's terms, varying commitments to the ideal of racial political community, to echo his words. Dr. Vaughn explores issues of preparedness and crisis management that have been scrutinized by a number of anthropologists, not only, however, in different geographic arenas, but through distinctive archives. She looks at how community disaster mitigation projects use techno-scientific culture and popular culture's newspapers, books, forms of humor to hierarchize some citizens as possessing more knowledge about floods than others in ways that are very complexly related to issues of race. But rather than positioning race as a stable part of an unstable equation, she explores how canals and flooding has, since the British colonial period, which was not all that long ago, been part of the politics of race. Talking both with and back to Brackett Williams' powerful work on the place of racial politics in Guyana's continuing colonial legacy, Dr. Vaughn continues to uniformly interpolate her interlocutors. She refuses to uniformly interpolate her interlocutors racially, bringing in their ethno-racial class designations only, in her words, at particular moments when my informants felt tension or anxiety over when to interpret their vulnerability to climate change as an effect of racial ethnic identity. post-colonial racism, or state racism. In a lovely article that appeared this year in Cultural Anthropology, takes us on a tour of a climatic zone in which I've also spent years, although across the border into Venezuela, coastal mangrove swamps, where eerie root structures extend into the sea. She examines how techno-scientific experts enter into alliances with mangroves in modeling particular ideas about plant and human agency and fostering competing futures as projected through different visions of mangrove protection, management, and/or change. She has thought carefully about how her own texts might either reproduce or disrupt the sort of linear and teleological narratives she engages critically. Accordingly, her work refracts these larger stories through immersion in the particulars of different sites, exploring the implications for constructions of citizenship and vulnerability to climate change. Her book in progress, Engineering Vulnerability, Climate Change, and Expertise in Guyana, is, I've heard, about the reformulation of expertise in politics that has occurred around the climate adaptation of a major canal system. She's also working on a project that considers the cultural overlaps in the mapping of extractive resources and human trafficking in Amazonia and also in Guyana. And I think you can see her title, and I think you can join me in being delighted that she's here at Berkeley and here
today. So thanks for coming today, and perhaps not surprisingly, giving the talk of the title of my talk. I'm looking at questions related to specifically participatory climate adaptation measures around Red Cross vulnerability assessments in a squatter town on the fringe of Guyana's capital city, Georgetown. And hopefully my narrative will lead you through that. So in 2009, I met with Margaret at her home in Sophia, a former squatter town on the fringe of Guyana's capital city, Georgetown. I have to get some glasses, she explained while walking to a kitchen cabinet. She collected the glasses and then made her way to the stove to boil water to clean them. I sat a few feet away next to a window, staring at a plastic vat in her backyard. Placed on a wooden platform, it appeared to levitate above surrounding weeds and a kitchen garden. Connected to it were two drain pipes that ran from the house's roof to channel rainwater. How often do you go to the vat for water? I asked. It depends who's coming over, when it rains, what I'm cooking. Margaret worries about water or floodwaters damaging the vat's platform. The vat has to be monitored at odd moments in the course of the day, week, month, year, and especially during the wet season. She's vigilant just like other Sophia residents. Even Red Cross staff visited after a disastrous flood in 2005 and warned of more, if not worse, flooding due to climate change. She grew accustomed to these warnings, with Red Cross staff holding training workshops about water safety and plastering signs throughout Sophia that read evacuation route. I use the vat only if the sky isn't too gray or the rain too heavy, she noted as she poured soda into our glasses. If the sky was gray and the rain heavy, she disinfected water with bleach and filtered it with a rag. Intuition is both a necessity and pleasure in itself. It spreads fast, even without the help of expert clarification. Margaret's vat informs her everyday routine and commitment to the Guyana Red Cross. Vats, along with rags and bleach used to filter water, are ordinary things, insofar as they can be found in most Guyanese households. In this talk, I examine the ways Red Cross training shapes people's understanding of the ordinary, or a common sense assumption about the consistency of life. For Margaret, the ordinary is experienced through talk, critiques, assessments, and rumors about climate adaptation. But as she suggests, even though the Red Cross has provided help to Sophia residents, she still lives in uncertainty about how her life will be impacted by climate change. The lessons Margaret learned from Red Cross training seem to get lost, or at the very least can get muddied by living in a flood zone. Then perhaps it's easier if I first tell a story about another kind of commitment, similar if not quite as simple. Unlike many places in South America, Guyana does not offer itself easily to development. Guyana's expansive forests alongside its limited roads make human settlement restricted to its low-lying coastal Atlantic plain. The colonial legacies of Dutch and British plantations are apparent in the physical irrigation and drainage grid as much as in the technical training of civil engineers. This arrangement between infrastructure and the engineering sciences supports the country's primary export, sugar and rice. Despite these arrangements, however, a torrent biannual wet season and sodden realities of the Atlantic Ocean and cascading Amazonian rivers make flooding a constant threat. With a decline in global trade preferences for Demerara sugar, a foreign debt amounting to over $1.8 billion US, and an 89% migration rate of post-secondary educated professionals, Guyana remains one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The irrigation and drainage grid thus has historically constituted a space for world imagining. And humanizing the space, whether on the backs of Amerindian and African slaves, Asian and Portuguese indentured laborers, or simply technocrats, is a story of flooding in Guyana. Still, drainage is not always clear-cut as the grid. The storms that contributed to Guyana's 2005 disaster were unprecedented compared to engineers' records that estimated 7 inches as the average monthly rainfall. The storm resulted in extensive flooding that impacted 62% of the nation's population, or roughly 520,000 people. Timing the release of the water from the coast's main dam, called the East Demerara Water Conservancy, or the EDWC, into canals was crucial. If water was released when the tide was high, Georgetown would have been inundated not only with water from the EDWC, but also the sea. Engineers devised a plan that allowed them to release water into a nearby river. This is very much a scenario that was similar to Houston a couple of weeks ago. And so while this strategy saved Georgetown in this instant, it further exacerbated flooding in rural communities. After the 2005 disaster, engineers worked with World Bank consultants to create hydraulic models for the EDWC. Scenarios were bleak. Whether from a rising tide or abnormal rainfall events, the EDWC was in need of a major overhaul and design to withstand future flooding. The hydraulic models offered more than a prognosis of climate change's impacts on Guyanese coastal drainage. They convinced the state that its top-down approach to flood management was limited, if not piecemeal. In turn, a number of different state agencies requested that local NGOs help establish community-based or participatory climate adaptation programs. The Red Cross took the lead with one of 4 pilot programs in Sophia. And so between 2009 and 10, Red Cross workers trained Sophia residents in vulnerability capacity assessment, or VCAs. Conceived of in the early 1990s to educate densely populated urban communities about environmental risks, the VCA is the core methodology of the International Red Cross's Federation of Volunteer Networks. Its primary activity includes people participating in focus groups and household surveys about vulnerability in places that they live. A mix of preparedness, relief, and coping strategies, Sophia's VCA centered on teaching residents how to use household water management equipment, or VATs, septic tanks, and water filtration kits. In a neighborhood of roughly 36,000 people, 5 male and 15 female adults regularly participated in Sophia's VCA training for a year. They volunteered to participate as VCA trainees after the Red Cross staff contacted the head of Sophia's community center. Already members of a community awareness group, the VCA trainees not only described themselves as community advocates, but familiar with drainage issues that affected Sophia. They had various occupational class and racial ethnic backgrounds, but most identified themselves as either Afro-Guyanese or mixed race. Some were unemployed, while others held multiple jobs as electricians, vendors, caretakers, political activists, teachers, and low-level community employees. This diversity influenced the knowledge exchange about flooding as well as expectations about the purpose of water management equipment. Training was led by a rotating group of 5 staff from the Guyana Red Cross, who for the most part had very different daily realities from those of the VCA trainees. Their home life, work, and leisure were shaped by Georgetown's middle-class environs, although some did have experience as first responders in 2005. In this respect, the VCA intended to chart a knowledge network beyond a preoccupation with disaster and its root causes. In turn, the water management equipment proved to be an important symbolic resource for remapping ordinary relations between expertise and accountability. And so any account of the ordinary requires, as cultural theorist Lauren Berlant argues, acknowledging the structural and repeated insecurities, i.e. poverty, pollution, or health disparities that can contribute to the deterioration of a population. As she elaborates, quote, "The genre of crisis is itself a heightening interpretive genre, rhetorically turning an ongoing condition into an intensified situation in which the extensive threats to survival are said to dominate the reproduction of life." Recognizing the failures of many post-World War II welfare state economic policies, Berlant argues that fantasies of the good life are bound to modes of self-care and self-management. Thus, instead of the ordinary being shaped by knowledge practices alone, Berlin suggests that confessional storytelling helps people make sense of how their daily and everyday lives are forged by continuous disruption. The genre of crisis, I suggest, can also be located in Margaret's narratives of VATS and, more broadly, the VCA survey and training activities. Instead of a focus on disaster, the VCA helps fire residents pay attention to how vulnerability manifests in the everyday. This emphasis on the processual rather than the event suggests that climate change has become an impasse to achieving or making a good life for oneself. Living with climate insecurity thus is marked less by the socio-technical demands of flood infrastructures than specific scenes of a working day, familial duties, and social obligations. In short, each VCA takes shape generically around a case study of vulnerability. By participating in Red Cross workshops, VCA trainees provide localized accounts of flood hazards at the same time that they attempt to make sense of the political and technical conditions that stabilize climate insecurities. There is, in other words, a steady invitation in participatory climate adaptation to reject the logics of flood infrastructures and state welfare crafted by large-scale engineering. This marks the arrival of a new kind of governance, one based not in managing risk per se, but rather in reimagining the ordinary. And so to make this argument, I first examined Guyana's broader socio-historical context of development and the 2005 disaster to show the shift in narratives about the ordinary related to participatory climate adaptation. The following two sections offer an analysis of how the VCA's water filtration kit undergirds the production of household vulnerability surveys. It's a document important to what the Red Cross calls ensuring the VCA's expansion across communities. I show that despite the stated intent of the survey, it provides only guidelines for how Sophia residents should use water filtration kits. In other words, the survey is a type of document geared toward representing an aspiration for adaptation rather than a description of it in practice. I suggest that this gap between imaginary and practice is generative of broader discussions about the ordinary as an analytic for ethnographies of climate change and the residual spaces for politics it can incite. Guyana is particularly vulnerable to climate change with 30% of the population residing in its low-lying capital city, Georgetown. Some areas are between 2 and 6 feet below sea level, bounded by a seawall, and an intricate grid of canals that drain rainwater and groundwater into the Atlantic. Georgetown's grid dates back to the 18th century, and the French, Dutch, and later the British settled the area as a colonial trading post. The city's canals were built on an autonomous grid, other than for the Lamaha Canal engineers dug in the 1830s to connect Georgetown to the EDWC for a potable water supply. So, for as long as the grid has existed, the Guyanese state has invested in shaping its citizens as modern subjects with the requisite sensibilities toward the ordinariness of flooding. Most notably, the post-independence state adopted a party doctrine of black nationalism and cooperative socialism in 1974, deeming self-sufficiency a compulsory dimension of flood management. What followed was a state-sponsored campaign called Feed, Clothe, and House the Nation that had ambitions to replicate Julius Nyeri's experiment with cooperatives in Tanzania. Residents functioned as members of neighborhood democratic councils responsible for maintaining public works. Civic groups cleaned waterways and reported their status to state agencies. However, the sense of environmental security and possibility opened up by the civic groups was tempered by concomitant debt crisis and electoral fraud. The 70s and early 80s bore witness to escalated political violence and the channeling of resources away from social services to political party financing. Some commentators view the legitimation crisis of the socialist period in conjunction with the withdrawal of IMF funding. These experiences of neglect led many citizens to abide by rather than flout state-sustained ideologies of self-sufficiency. And so elements of this ideology did not dissipate with Guyana's transition from socialism to markets and liberal democracy in the late 1980s. These reforms are targeted through a structural adjustment policy called the Economic Recovery Program. While the president implemented a variety of tax schemes through the Economic Recovery Program, it also focused on reducing the number of state agencies. To fill the technical vacuum, IMF-sponsored development projects required that non-state officials or grassroots actors had to play an active role in project implementation. In practice, however, many grassroots actors were political elites. Moreover, the cuts in state spending the Economic Recovery Program proposed were not matched with adequate measures to help neighborhood democratic councils maintain housing stocks, roads, and canals. Similar to other post-socialist and post-colonial societies, structural adjustment policies in Guyana created fissures between the complex techniques citizens devise to survive the everyday and their experiences of participation in development. Mark Pelling, for instance, argues that many Georgetown residents could not gain state approval for new canals because funding agencies feared that the projects would conflict with the goals of ongoing housing renewal programs. In turn, quote, the failure of government to maintain secure living environments, Pelling argues, produced a bifurcated practice in urban flood management. On the one hand, households responded individually to flood hazards, and on the other, large-scale infrastructure improvements were dependent on development projects. And so while Pelling may argue that these competing flood responses were in tension with Georgetown residents' ideals about political empowerment, the hazards of the biannual wet season remain rather predictable. Between 1990 and 2004, there was only one significant flood in Georgetown, and that was the event not attributed to rainfall but a seawall breach. Hence, state agencies and non-governmental institutions, including the Red Cross, were active in providing relief aid, but there was no established coordinating unit for disaster preparedness or for that matter, post-disaster planning. This dilemma was most telling during the 2005 disaster. The multiple storms in January caused record water levels in the EDWC, which worsened downstream conditions in Georgetown's Lamahawk Canal. So you can see in this map here of the EDWC, and the EDWC is about 330 square miles, so it's a huge earthen dam dug in the 1860s, right after emancipation. And so the point is that EDWC is right behind the major population districts within Guyana. Gaisuto is state-owned land for sugar plantations, but there's still a lot of squatting and some housing development. And then here the hashtag area is Georgetown. This red line here is the Lamahawk Canal, the initial canal dug for the EDWC in the 1820s. And Sophia was one of the first estates at the time, now the former squatting area for which the Lamahawk Canal was dug. And here this red line is one of the post-disaster new storm relief channels that the engineers have been building. But for the most part, I show this map because it, I think, dramatizes the importance of thinking about the safety of this dam, which again is earthen. So therefore, like with the 2005 disaster, if you have a lot of rain, there's the possibility that it could collapse, which was part of the problem again in 2005. So Sophia itself is located right along this red strip here. And so given that in 2005 the state was ill-prepared to respond to the vulnerabilities of both the EDWC and Polity, civic and UN organizations provided assistance to affected populations. In real time, these organizations conducted surveys about the household resources impacted populations used to cope. Alyssa Trott suggests that as a result, information about the disaster's impacts on households went underrepresented in government reports. Part of the effect of this informational vacuum was that the state, for instance, could not provide basic info about how floodwaters would affect daily routines, such as access to public transportation. In many respects, the disaster created an arena for the consolidation of a public discourse about participation alongside the mobilization of a new social imaginary about the ordinary. Thus, it's worth following the emergence of participatory climate adaptation projects in Guyana, not simply because they fill a bureaucratic vacuum. They also offer a new imaginary of the ordinary, as circumscribed less by the geography of the irrigation and drainage grid than the humble water management equipment that circumvent it. And so by 2009, the Guyana Red Cross positioned itself as the main architect of this geography, proceeding with a program in participatory climate adaptation that emphasized BCAs. The program built on the report background document for the preparedness of climate change, completed by 23 other Red Cross national societies in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. The report details the efforts of national societies to use IPCC climate data to spur greater collaboration between state agencies and local communities. And so even without full scientific analyses on climate projections, the Red Cross argues, it can engage and offer an abiding appeal of immediacy. Humanitarianism in a changing climate, the report suggests, is rooted in identifying climatic risks that will affect technologies and resources for programs such as the VCA. As climate change increasingly frames humanitarian sentiment, it provides a ready measure, easily quantified and statistically represented for negotiating the terms of participation. As a Red Cross worker notes in the report, successful climate adaptation involves not only disaster relief, but the expansion of VCA methods across communities. And so the 2005 disaster makes evident that the relation between climate-related flooding and vulnerability are not mapped neatly onto divisions between public and private. Both domains, so it appeared, needed to adapt to climate change. The intensity of the January storms eroded people's confidence in the EDWC at the same time that conceptions of self-sufficiency became yardsticks for judging survival and not simply the viability of local government agencies. Scholars examining other climate-related disasters, including Margaret Summers and her take on Hurricane Katrina, she argues that typically the failure of flood infrastructure disrupts relations of public and private responsibility for goods and services. This focus on political transaction, however, reinforces the idea that participatory climate adaptation will have obvious civic outcomes and a design that can supersede the environment at hand. Instead, I emphasize that participatory climate adaptation requires a politics beyond rights claims and civic government to one that reaffirms the pragmatics of everyday survival and expertise. The VCA is a tacit reminder, thus, of the threat climate change poses to Guyana, and that discourses about participation shape a broader experience of the ordinary. For this reason, I caution against viewing participatory climate adaptation as a mere ideological effect of neoliberal development. Analyses that appeal to this teleology assign historical finality, where many climate-vulnerable populations seek to assert practical solutions for living with hazards. Indeed, discovering practical solutions to hazards is not only a preoccupation of those living in post-disaster or marginalized global South contexts. Bruce Braun describes parallel sensibilities in England, where climate adaptation involves a profanation of technologies, such as fuel gauges and electric cars, to modulate natural processes in the everyday. But technologically bounded representations of the ordinary are not the only possible register through which participatory climate adaptation is made legible. I use the remainder of this talk to further detail participatory climate adaptation as it's directed toward various activities for maintaining daily life. One afternoon in 2009, I sat with Stephen on the balcony of the community center in Sophia's Beefield district looking at photographs. They were black and white and printed on typing paper. The reflected glare of the sun blurred the images of murky trench water and debris. One by one, he pulled photographs from his manila folder, explaining, "I just didn't have enough time to film and to catch everything." A few weeks prior, he rode through Beefield looking for eroded canal embankments. His pictures resembled the aerial photographs of compromised dams taken by engineers during the 2005 disaster. Late to the scene, Stephen and the engineers were witnesses who did not know when the disturbance began or would end. Stephen boasted about how meticulous he was, but admitted that his photographs only depicted part of the story. He reminded me, "I didn't get into people's yards. I don't know what they do to stop floods." Stephen surmised that Sophia residents' yards, and by extension their homes, are much more complex sites for a range of intimacies with flooding and its containment. These intimacies were often the topic of discussion at VCA training. Community Center, Red Cross workers focused a number of meetings on teaching VCA trainees how to assemble and use do-it-yourself water filtration kits. Filled with things in most Guyanese households, the water filtration kits include towels, chlorine bleach, and bottles. VCA trainees have to be careful not to contaminate the bottles and towels when collecting water from across vats, wells, buckets, and faucets to boil. Likewise, VCA trainees have to be vigilant, even after initial collection of water, and monitor their bodies for exposure to dysentery, cholera, or leptospirosis. Puddles in yards increase the possibility of exposure even after floods. Red Cross workers suggested that not only should each household in Sophia have a water filtration kit, but that VCA trainees should agree to hold periodic tutorials at the community center. A routinized procedure, the water filtration kits provide guidelines for how to respond to health risks, whatever the conditions of a particular household. Important here is not that the VCA training is tied to ideals about acts of volunteerism. These ideals are shot through with a mix of cynicism and aspiration, sentiments that informed many VCA trainees' interests in the Red Cross in the first place. Instead, the training reflects what Kathleen Stewart calls cultural poesis, or an intense attention to the generativity and endurance of things in daily life. It's a kind of attention that, quote, arises in the effort to know what is happening or to be part of it, and the exciting presence of traces, remainders, and excesses. And so while the water filtration kits provide a routinized procedure, they also call users' attention to moments of impact between bodies and floods that are far from straightforward or causal. A cultural poiesis of hazards, while a complex relation of things, also depends on how trainees are hailed by others who might experience flood-related loss, damage, or injury in different ways. VCA trainees struggle to talk about these experiences when they developed household vulnerability surveys. They brainstormed a number of questions for the survey. Does your family have a water filtration kit? How high were the last floodwaters in your home? Do you have an evacuation route? They also developed an appendix for the surveys that included a space for each respondent to list the responsibilities of family members, neighbors, and local state agencies in the event of a flood. As VCA trainees brainstormed, a Red Cross worker interjected to help. He explained, "This is bottom up. We never know exactly what will happen or to expect, but you can come together to help bring out the best in each other." With a successful track record managing other community-based environmental programs, this Red Cross worker was well rehearsed in making participatory decision-making appear self-evident. He encouraged VCA trainees to share testimonials about floods and their use of water filtration kits. One VCA trainee noted, "We don't want to keep each other company at these meetings, and I say we deal with this kit now and get this over so that when something else really big happens again, we need everyone to understand that we need to be sufficient. I don't have all the information. This is why we need training. We all need to know where flooding happens, to know what then we need to do to take care of ourselves. Some water will come in your yard and maybe not mine." This VCA trainee recognizes that he has some understanding about drainage on his property, but very minimal understanding of its dynamics throughout Greater Sophia. In these terms, he does not know in advance of a flood how the water filtration kit will help him. He can only guess. His testimonial dramatizes the plural uses of water filtration kits while creating a meta-narrative about the common occurrence of flood hazards in Sophia. Testimonials, in other words, serve multiple purposes for training in water filtration. On the one hand, they facilitate a discussion about the kinds of material evidence trainees can find and gather in their daily lives to monitor water supplies. On the other, testimonials triggered conversations about the rather open-ended dynamics of caring for things and bodies that climate change demands. As an activity, testimonials remind us that living in crisis depends on people withholding judgment about the future. In particular, a number of VCA trainees talked about leptospirosis to emphasize the deep sense of nervousness they have come to attribute to water contamination. Leptospirosis is a bacterial infection that is spread through direct contact with urine from infected animals or soil. And so while there were just over 40 cases of infection alongside drowning and dehydration, leptospirosis caused 19 of the 34 disaster-related deaths in Guyana in 2005. And so livestock owners in Guyana used their bottom flats as spaces to herd mostly sheep and cattle during the disaster. The tense mix of human and non-human bodies registered in exchange. Some passed on health officials' warnings to not handle livestock carcasses and to keep them as far away from the interior of the house as possible to limit the spread of infection. Others started a relief system where people volunteered to go to a shelter or a hospital in Georgetown to retrieve drugs to pass along to family, neighbors, and friends. VCA trainees admitted, however, that based on their 2005 disaster experience, they had not developed a good sense for infection and often attributed their nausea, headaches, and fever to other diseases. Just about every bodily ailment they have come to associate with leptospirosis. They discovered that concentrating on how much rain saturates the ground is their best chance at diagnosis. Another VCA trainee emphasized this point about diagnosis when he suggested that climate-related flooding challenges reason. He said, "I'm trying to provoke a thought about what to do with different levels of water. Say it's like 2 feet of water. Right away you got to think of health, the latrine, Say you begin with 5 or 3 feet of water. But again, what's the difference really? You have to now move because it's beyond, bearable. But wherever you go, you're still exposed to a health risk. That's the thing. We know that about 90% of our septic tanks aren't constructed the way they need for safety. But with the flood, it compromises both the person and the infrastructure. The kits are helpful, to a point I guess, but I still feel that with a septic tank, I'm safer than without." This VCA trainee has become less confident in drainage and so even more reliant on water filtration kits. His reference to 3 to 5 feet of water, those experienced during the 2005 disaster, have become his new norm for living comfortably with floods. Yet he also notes that flood hazards related to leptospirosis and faulty septic tanks are difficult to discern no matter the flood's water level. As a knowledge practice, testimonials shape the powerful tension between what can be known and what remains unspeakable about the impacts of changing climate on the ordinary. And so these testimonials about vulnerability to climate change are quite distinct from what scholars describe of testimonials about such processes as violence and human suffering. Both types of testimonials address complex experiences of displacement in daily life brought about by structural inequalities and crises. With the VCA, however, trainees not only narrate displacement, but emphasize ways in which these experiences shape intuition. In these testimonials, intuition is described as a porous mix of affective, epistemological, technological, and bodily processes. Mark Carey has described parallel concerns about glacial knowledge and climate change. Shaped by a cultural framework embedded in daily life of not only science but humble forms of water management equipment, glacial knowledge represents, quote, ice itself as an element of change and as a thing that is part of society. Given the prominent place of glaciers in the global discourse about climate change, Carey suggests that the idiom cryoscapes is one way to describe the relations between people and ice. A similar dynamic is at play for VCA trainees in Guyana, where floodscapes mediate ethical decisions about what counts as a water filtration kit and the kinds of knowledge it shapes about the unpredictability of daily life impacted by climate change. The testimonials reinforce the idea that living with crisis cannot be contained through rigid training or, for that matter, witnessing alone. At times, the reality of this mundane fact can cease to be significant or burst into VCA trainees' lives and demand that it cannot be ignored. A few weeks into their efforts, VCA trainees completed pilot surveys of households in an area of Sophia known as Northfield. Deemed on the fringes of Sophia's fertile lands, Northfield postdates Sophia's era of informal housing, circa 1999. More homes are built on surveyed plots, but is located in a catchment near the outfalls of the Atlantic. Despite the lack of census data, it's rumored to be higher income Indo-Guyanese and mixed-raced area, albeit with numerous female-headed households. My interlocutors expressed intrigue about the data they would collect. The mere presence of these households complicated their collective awareness of vulnerability. These households are economically secure but inhabit a space that is more flood-prone than the rest of Sophia. VCA trainees recognize that floods do not care who lives where, but that it was their responsibility to create alliances between vulnerable bodies and spaces. Data collection for the surveys was not easy. For the survey, Sophia's VCA trainees were joined by staff from other Caribbean Red Cross branches looking to complete their volunteer certification. The irony was not lost on VCA trainees who were instructed by Guyana's Red Cross staff to act as cultural ambassadors for the day. It's worth noting that many of the VCA trainees did not view these foreigners as intruders or as an affront to their work, but as needed labor for the tall task of surveying. They surmised that the surveys would tell them something more general about how floods might vary across space. The survey circulated as a genre that became following Berlant, quote, eliminated from its location in someone's story or some locale's irreducibly local history. This means that the surveys were not merely constituted by speech acts such as brainstorming activities and testimonials performed at prior meetings. Their time surveying Northfield was also an embodied practice that created the terms for the survey circulation. Take, for instance, the ditches, weeds, and fire anthills that surrounded the entryways of many homes. Both harbingers and impasses, VCA trainees learned how to slow their gait and brush insects off their bodies to avoid being injured by these obstacles. While most Northfield residents ventured from their homes to their yards to greet VCA trainees, some shouted their answers from windows, and a few simply didn't venture out to meet them on public roads. The obstacles VCA trainees faced dramatized that each survey was differently constructed by entanglements between humans, terrain, and flood hazards. Data collection was not limited by the boundary between the home and the public road either. It's performed within domestic spaces as well. A woman by the name of Renee spoke in extensive detail about cement blocks she used to protect her house's foundation from floodwaters. She insisted while she felt high above the ground, she often relied on her dog's movements and barking to warn her of heavy rainfall. Her children moved furniture away from windows and put plastic tarps over holes of the tin roof when it rained. Renee's vulnerability emerged in discontinuity with things that construct human and non-human boundaries of the ordinary. The testimonial convinced VCA trainees that Sophia's emergency contact list should include not only phone numbers and home addresses, but also the number of pets and households. In contrast, not all of Northfield's residents were committed to an ethos that equated the VCA with testimonials about vulnerability. In one interview, a Northfield resident interjected in the middle of questioning to suggest that the VCA only matters if drainage improves. The VCA made him feel proud of Sophia but irritated by how he lives. He dramatized his point by making VCA trainees stand on top of an eroding canal embankment near his yard. Moved by their willingness to indulge him, he insisted that the VCA could and would make Northfield residents more accepting of floods. At issue in his reprimand are concerns about the way private lives and flood hazards may often intersect, but at the same time, the processes that can conjure competing imaginaries about daily life. The survey in Northfield thus animates the genre of crisis in two ways. First, any evidence of a potential flood has made a case for collecting more testimonials to get a richer sample of probable scenarios of vulnerability. Second, Sophia residents use these testimonials to question the VCA trainees' authority and their conventional social identities as community advocates. Some, like Renee, claim to rise above water. Others wear their vulnerability like a badge of honor, optimistic that with a bit more effort, they can force other people and things to become more accountable. But is the VCA a tool to warn Northfield residents of the vulnerabilities that might have not caught their attention? Or is it intended to mobilize another kind of world? VCA trainees attempted to address this ambiguity, particularly those who desired to put the survey to use beyond Red Cross activities. Some planned to create a flood library and research center at the community center to have information on hand to improve future VCAs. Others intended to use the survey to lobby the Ministry of Agriculture to drain and dredge canals and improve embankments. They debated how to present the survey to state officials. A PowerPoint they surmised was a distraction that would make them appear too well adapted to climate change. They agreed that an informal presentation was the best way to communicate. The conversation would be directed by no more than 10 residents as to not overwhelm and remind state officials that Sophia is indeed a cumbersome place. They desired to take on the persona of accommodating experts who, out of urgency and need, could work with state agencies' limited resources. Surviving every day requires a light touch and the ability to assimilate the possibilities and foreclosures that flood hazards incite. But despite these plans, they never made it to the ministry and instead drafted a letter that outlined their grievances. Vulnerability, so it is said, is socially constructed within narratives of identity in place, with varying structures and powers of authorization. And so the interplay of knowledge, self-presentation, eco-biological processes, and testimonials established through VCAs create a discernible communicative context for ethical commitments to participation. Yet, the VCA does not guarantee redress or even a better life. To say all of this, of course, is not to dismiss outright VCAs and the moral economies in which they traffic as various kinds of anti-politics. It may be this, but it may not only be this. The VCA demonstrates that participatory climate adaptation does not mark clear distinctions between expert and non-expert methods for monitoring flood hazards. These distinctions have long been emphasized in studies of vulnerability and political ecology more broadly. Instead, I've suggested that the increased frequency of intensified rainfall due to climate change has blurred distinctions between expert and non-expert in Guyana. This blurring creates the conditions for new thoughts and informs contestations that emerge around relations of accountability. These relations are quite different from what Bruno Latour calls matters of concern or the defense of facts for the sake of ideological or political gain. This is because as long as they took initiative, VCA trainees believed that they were adapting and that their injuries due to climate-related flooding could be addressed on a case-by-case basis. VCA training began as a routinized effort to convey flood knowledge and a skill set in water filtration, but shifted in the real time of data collection and unfolded into a scene of adaptation itself. The VCAs are not the result of the technical or political compulsions of a few individuals, nor are they mere expressions of vulnerability that follow historically formalized understandings of neoliberal development or, for that matter, state abandonment. Yet they are not, for that reason, solely dependent on local particularities of a hazardous place. VCA trainees understand that climate adaptation entails the constant adjustment of expectations about accountability and survival. VCA trainees express a mix of indifference, fear, hope, and cynicism. VCAs are not a departure from the reduction in despair that so often absorbs genuine energy for humanitarian interventions. Rather, VCAs provide trainees guidelines to first build up the capacity to identify flood hazards and second, to learn to live with them. This sort of ecological realism can be stifling just as much as it can be a foundation for change beyond pragmatism and insist on a new materialism. And so between VCA trainees' testimonials and Stephen's photography lies a difference not in textual interpretation or citation, but ethical political sensibilities toward participation. To this extent, an ethnographic focus on scenes of the ordinary may help explain why and how the circulation of climate change-related data, models, and information matters to non-techno-scientific publics. And so what I've presented today is part of a book project that tracks the management of the civil engineering sciences and contestations over expertise related to climate adaptation. Given the Sophia case of VCAs, I want to suggest that one of the pernicious effects of climate change has been the erosion of the status of the expert. By this, I don't mean simply that the expert has been alienated, delegitimized, or marginalized in favor of populist narratives of redemption or apocalyptic futures, though there is some truth to these claims. There's nothing new about this order of social costs paid for the benefit of hydraulic models or processes of modernization. I'm referring to a more radical and less visible process whereby the broad social canvas in which the expert, both as category and as social fact, has been thinned out in favor of a more general description of the current interval dominated by human activity destroying the planet. Many scientists and social theorists have described this interval as the Anthropocene. However, I've taken a different approach throughout this talk to describe human activity. I've argued that the interval of ordinary life, or more specifically the day-to-day labor of knowledge production, helps us capture a more nuanced understanding of what is required to imagine life beyond mass extinction. Ordinary life is something perhaps like the geostrata from which the expert emerges, the precursor and precondition of thinking relations of accountability in the midst of a warming planet. My proposition that living an ordinary life requires that one learns to become accountable may reinvigorate debates about the nature and history of technosciences in society. And more to the point, ordinary life is an analytic that might perhaps recognize the blurred geopolitical boundaries of modernization. This means that participatory climate adaptation is not an exercise in representation or a critique of the possible publics that delimits its fields of power. Far from a definitive appraisal of vulnerability, politics, or ethics, participatory climate adaptation illuminates ways of knowing that inform ordinary life. It recognizes the hubris involved in such a task. At the same time, it gestures to the limits of human knowledge while leaving open the possibility of finding other models of knowing and living with climate change. Thank you.
On if that's okay, and we have some time for questions if that's all right with you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the word participatory, and is that your label or the label of the trainees or the label of the trainers or?
So the Red Cross came in describing this project as participatory. The larger context within Guyana, as I briefly gestured to, was after with liberalization, this idea of participation really became tied to ideas of development projects as opposed to the idea that people could work through their local government agencies in order to get anything done. And so these, I would argue, I guess, like in many other contexts of thinking development, these projects became sort of the ways in which people on the ground and people within these development networks understood what it meant to think participation, which meant you're not working through the state, you're working through us as these local kinds of, or I shouldn't say local, national kinds of organizations that might also have a link to broader international programs such as the Red Cross in this case, or more specifically in Guyana, the UNDP. So it was very much still a top-down understanding, one could argue, of participation, yet it was one that was very much delinked from the idea of the state providing that kind of resource or understanding of participation, which was historically the case before the 80s.
So that was a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate the moves you're making to sort of, shift our thinking about not diagnosing the cause of the problem, but to how we're coping with it on a daily basis. So I have actually 3 questions. I probably won't be able to articulate them all, but one, so I imagine, this is an aside, you don't have to answer it, but I wonder if there's a parallel in the literature from medical anthropology and health development about the training of village health workers. They certainly were charged with doing the same kinds of things, and I doubt that it's packaged as the treaties on ordinary, but it's still the same kinds of things have been happening for generations in that world, and probably in some of the same ways. Although probably not with the sophistication of how, one's sensibilities have been changed by this, which I love that part of your talk. Okay, so the questions are, I hear your critique, I may not have gotten it exactly right, but there's you're setting up this sort of an argument with Margaret Summers and the neoliberal arguments, rights-based arguments about, climate change, or how we should deal with climate change, and shifting to the possibility of reading these as these actions as not a consequence of that, but, or maybe just more importantly, as the things we should be paying attention to. But have you been engaged by people who have, and you probably have an answer to this, who will say, well, why not both and, right? Because it's certainly what you're describing is the classic neoliberal situation where the state's been vacated and the Red Cross and the village community resource base is now the source of intervention. And the preparedness language is a new thing that didn't exist in the colonial era. So this is a new framework for shifting responsibilities away from, the colonial and the post-colonial regimes that actually felt it was the state's responsibility. So how are you not sort of vulnerable to the same critique that, yeah, it's fine, they're doing this, but why not go to the source? Why not look at the, this is the other side of the Katrina story. So why doesn't looking at their amazing adaptations and ordinariness making of these practices actually sort of conceal these bigger problems that have to do with, big structural Anthropocene-like problems? And then the third part was about whether the history of Guyana's engagement with flooding actually is part of your argument about why it can become ordinary there, but wouldn't necessarily be seen that way in other places.
Right, and so this is, I think, no hubris here, perhaps one of the very difficulties of doing ethnography is about climate change, which is there's two sides of the story. And so when I present this, it's like, okay, am I talking about the engineers today, or am I going to talk about sort of the response from the said participatory perspective on the ground? In fact, part of my larger argument, which I think is getting to your point, is that you can't do one without the other, and that an ethnography of climate change demands that we take on both perspectives at once. And so part of this claim about flooding in Guyana is that it's always been steeped in this understanding of a day-to-day labor, if only because of the particular kinds of place-based terrain there, which is specifically this idea that we can dam the coast with earthen canals and dams, which is insane, right? But that has been the case since the Dutch and the British era, and that is how engineers there have been trained. And so their daily work is part of my argument. It's not just simply, oh, look at science and practice in the everyday. It's that when your models fail, how are you rethinking and reconceptualizing what it means to do engineering as a day-to-day practice that then feeds into all these different kinds of, lack of a better word, networks of collaboration. And part of this argument is this sort of VCA work is part of that network of collaboration. And so I'm really interested in not so much, yes, neoliberalism is not part of this project, but rather what happens when that critique is just the critique and we know we're living with it, and what is the other sort of like claims that get made around it as you try to move forward despite the cynicism, I think. But no, it's well taken, and I always get that. For example, today in class, we were reading something, and I tried to convince my students, hey, well, right, it's not just, we were actually talking about Katrina. So it's not just a plight of, suffering and vulnerability because of, disenfranchised, black subjects. What happens if we think about the hurricane itself in relation to that kind of critique over time? What happens when we have to take seriously both claims, right? And it was, an open question, I would argue, and one I'm still grappling with. But I don't think, especially in a place like Guyana, where flooding has always been a problem, right? And their only engineering and technology is damming, to honestly say that, oh, we're not really thinking about climate change, it's just we need bigger and better dams? No, right? And if it's not just bigger and better dams, how do you describe that? It can't just be neoliberal development has made Guyana the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. There's another side to that story. And so that's the entanglement I'm trying to get at. And I think practically that answer is saying, I'm studying the engineers while I'm studying these people doing these VCAs and asking how those points of contacts are made or not made.
Well, kind of on that, I'm trying to wrap my, well, not on that. What we all, and most of these disciplines related to climate change, trying to do or accomplish, or I didn't kind of put in how to consolidate our evidence, information, and politics. So I'm going to liberalism and this kind of stuff here. Anyway, so I didn't know what I was getting into coming here. I came up to try to find that genius young scientist who was on KPFA a few weeks ago. I'm living in Los Angeles now. Okay. But anyway, what I've kind of just noticed going around, there's a lot of information around, but okay. There needs to be a way to consolidate it and just leave that there. What is also needed is the black and brown community having often discussions about climate change or Kaepernick. So I'm not assigning anybody here, but I want to engage their minds or their friends and try to bring this about, because really people need to get used to meeting when they need to talk about something, like what's happening in Puerto Rico or Kaepernick, okay, or the police stuff. But anyway, so we can't conjure it up, but I think if people put their minds to it and their skills, so I came here to sort of save that. A lot of other things, but I will leave it at that. This has been a fun discussion, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, part of that conversation is, in a very crude sense, when our former models have failed, right, whether as critique or as, a progressive politics, whatever that might mean, yeah. When and how do you decide to have that moment of engagement, and most importantly, where, right? So perfect example would be, this reads a lot like Houston. It doesn't read a lot like Katrina in terms of how the storms actually happened. Why and how and when do I become accountable to make this claim that this is about Houston as opposed to Katrina, right? Or whatever the stakes might be for the room of engagement. But I also think that's also this broader claim about evidence. Like, how does one decide to use evidence to talk about, these problems in a quote global South context, as opposed to, I don't know, Sandy, where one could argue a lot of that conversation has been around, the great things that engineers are doing. Well, there are also great things engineers are doing in Guyana, right? But there's a particular way in which, right, evidence is used or made to make a claim about what's more important or not around this climate change debate and who's actually part of it. Right?
So it's wonderful to see where you invest the same sort of care and careful layering in the work, but where some of the analytics have gone in your treatment of these materials over the last few years. So I have one little question, because something went by that I just really liked so quickly. I want to make sure I got it right, and maybe you could see a little bit more. The people who are doing leptospirosis diagnosis on the basis of the height of the standing water. I mean, that's really interesting if you think about what that would mean as diagnosis and what that brings together. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more. The other question is partly, in terms of thinking about the everyday, of course, I kind of have a little bit of Vina Das going on in my brain there. And Vina seems to really be interested as well in how paths become accessible, particularly in fragments that seem to get lodged in bodies, in spaces, in activities within the ordinary. So I wonder partly what kind of paths, we look so much at partly how the displacement from big futures into moments of the ordinary, which is really nice. What about paths and how they become accessible through this process?
So your first question, I think the most dramatic way to put it, and my argument is, when the 2005 disaster happened, the first so the state thought they were going to do it on their own, and in fact they made a blatant attempt and said, we don't need international help until like the fifth storm in January, when they were thinking, that's so very similar, right? Coming in the past 2 months or so. When they said, actually, our dam might just collapse. Can you bring in people? Some of the first people, not surprisingly, were health workers. So the first responses on the ground around the disaster itself was around, we just had a guy come in with leptospirosis. What are we going to do, right? And so the first response was taking care of that health threat. But at the same time, engineers are in the background, right? Recognizing, these floodwaters are going ways we weren't expecting. The dam might still burst. So despite the fact that on the one hand you have health workers on the ground who are apparently containing the problem at hand, no one's really dying. Really, only 34 people died, right? And yes, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, after a month and a half of flooding, it's pretty remarkable, right? And so that's contained, but then you have the engineers in the background who are saying, wait, these floods are going different places. So the point is there's a sort of bifurcation of expertise that's happening. My argument is when you have these extended and intensified flood events, where it's not just simply you can say the body's injured, therefore we have a problem, or the body is healed, therefore we can move forward. Rather, it's how are you dealing with these different registers and spatial and temporal understandings of expertise, because these events have magnified a problem or maybe even hidden a problem as the event unfolds, which I think perhaps is quite more dramatically displayed when it's an event that's outside of the existing normal rainfall counts as opposed to your annual flood event. Your point about past, I mean, it's sort of maybe too dramatic and poetic, but frankly, the luck of working in an ethnographic context where you have infrastructures in this landscape that dates back, and people know, to slavery, right? And the fact that, you have these dams that weren't part of the Dutch system in 1500s to the 1800s, but specifically about emancipation, and the fact that estate owners are trying to figure out how to block out competition from freedmen and indentured laborers. This past is sort of always just being bubbled up, not because it's a land and this is our nation state land, but rather that you have to become even more cognizant and aware that like different kinds of ecological processes and different kinds of terrain allow one to think engineering, right, or not. Most places this idea of damming is not even, like Houston. There wasn't really much conversation after Houston about whether or not we should even dam. But why not, right? Or why are there dams in Houston and not in Louisiana, even though this damming technique, as in most parts of the world, replicated TVA model, Tennessee Valley Authority model, versus the half of our country is a TVA style kind of damming, but we don't have that damming, for example, if you wanted to in Louisiana, why not, right? And so I guess my point is just taking seriously these different kinds of ecologies and terrain allows one then, I think, to make this claim about this past that might be a bit distinct from thinking about the ordinary, right, as a kind of very immediate take on, how to survive.
Thank you for your talk. I was trying to figure out how to conceptualize the question in maybe just the simplest way. I'm just really curious about the way that you're trying to have crisis and vulnerability speak to each other in your analytic, and thinking about both the experience of how vulnerability was perhaps being produced and reproduced in the survey piece, which seemed to be both responsive to a crisis, but also trying to create sort of a cumulative norm around. I want to hear more. I want to hear more about that, because I'm also was thinking a lot about the ways in which crises, at least in public discourse, and we were talking about Houston a bunch of times, sort of shine a bright light on vulnerability that then can remain or disappear, depending on the position of the viewer, and how you're sort of thinking about that relative to the ordinary, which is sort of an embodied presence.
Exactly. Well, so, and like in many other contexts, I've gotten weird looks and trying to figure out what to do with this. I mean, part of this project for me, I'm sort of really invested in, despite this presentation, thinking expertise itself as a general category. And vulnerability, though, I really like the way you put it, because for me, vulnerability is part of that question of inquiry, right? It's not just a question which I often find is one about how to manage or think about populations proper, but rather to take seriously, if we take vulnerability as an analytic about knowledge production, and not just, the outcome of particular kinds of events and the causal relations, but what it means to actually do a practice of knowledge production, I think then we get to, perhaps, at least in the climate change context, a more sort of productive understanding of why it matters that, in one context you might use this kind of damming or this kind of modeling, and in another context you might want to just only think about, vulnerability surveys. So thinking about vulnerability as a more broader analytic about knowledge production as opposed to just the body or just kinds of injury, whatever that injury might be, has been helpful for me. And so then in relationship to crisis then becomes a direct claim about a kind of temporal and spatial arrangement in which vulnerability, or the ways in which you think about vulnerability as a site of knowledge production, or a process of knowledge production, is how I wanted to try to arrange the terms.
My question sort of builds on Kelly's and your response, which is to just ask you to maybe say a little bit more about how you're conceptualizing expertise. Because alongside vulnerability, you started and then had a piece around intuition, where you talked about intuition, I think, as a pleasure and a need in and of itself. And you said it spreads fast even without experts. So, but then it seemed like later in the talk, these ordinary citizens were, in their ordinary practices, framed as experts themselves. They were the accommodating experts. So is expertise a professionalized position, a relationship to the state, or a form of knowledge, or to vulnerability itself? There's sort of a constellation there that I was hoping to clarify.
So expertise I would define as a practical skill set in anything. And in this particular case, for sure, I would understand expertise as not a professionalized sort of claim, but one in which someone is just building a skill set in a practical domain. So that could be, learning how to walk, or building a canal. But I think what's particular about the climate adaptation context is that citizens are being propelled, whether it's through these top-down sort of participatory projects, or just because they're tired of living around puddles and flood, that they figure out how to relate their sense of expertise vis-a-vis the state. And it might be a sort of a familiar way of how, quote, ordinary citizens respond to the state by saying, I have my own expertise. But I think my point here is that if you take seriously, expertise is not about just sort of the top-down approach to, say, techno-science, but rather this sort of collaborative frame, the collaborations that come out of the fact that these very said models, or these very kind of state infrastructures are failing. Collaboration, at least within the context of climate adaptation, becomes the mode by which people understand when to make a claim to expertise or not. So these VCAs become a way in which these Sophia residents can say, oh, I'm actually contributing to the fact that we have sort of derelict infrastructure. This new EDWC modeling might not be working, but it's still, I think, a very particular claim about saying we're actually, in a very sort of symbolic way, collaborating with the state. Now, engineers, for example, as I tracked in other places, are doing actual collaborations with different kinds of experts. But part of this point is that with climate adaptation, whether it comes down as a collaboration in terms of in a practical sense or a symbolic sense, I think that's what's implied here, because the realization is that our said experts not that they don't know what to do, but they're struggling to articulate a kind of new model of what it means to live with dams, and those dams in this case are no longer functioning as they should. Yeah.
There's something. Summerson Carr did an interesting review of Anthropology piece on expertise, where she sort of thought also about issues of socialization, but also form and performance. And sort of thinking about, the institutionalization of ways of seeing of authorized and authorizing domains, which seems to really work beautifully with exactly what you're arguing, precisely about how one thinks about diagnosis as again being how high the water is rather than simply what is read on a test. So it seems like various ways in which form and performance, and precisely sort of course also the problem of the production of non-knowledge, which also always comes along with issues of expertise.
Right. So this point, just not having a skill, not just having a practical skill set, but also expertise is a kind of enactment. Particularly with climate adaptation, around how models get enacted or don't get enacted. And so when they don't get enacted, this is the moment of, do we need collaboration? And how and in what ways does that mode and ethos about collaboration spread or not, right? So going back to your other question. Yes?
What I kind of noticed over the years, 15, 20 years, is how there's been not conspiratorially covering up climate change. They're talking around it. And I don't believe in this government conspiracy, but the 100-year storms. I worked for East Bay Mud until I got fired in 2003. They were always giving all this propaganda in the 80s and 90s about, drought, how to do this, how to do that, how education is. This time around, I just noticed they weren't very educational about the drought. And I noticed this tendency basically keeping the public more ignorant than they should be. I don't think it's conspiracy. I just think it's the way they've somehow been able to have that fly. A couple of things to think about with the real estate mega brokers and then the future flood maps or sea rise maps of Florida. What is Goldman Sachs and what are they thinking about that? Or what are they doing about that? It's not a practical question, but they know what's happening, even though they're denying it. And so, like I said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but they're doing. Okay, I actually don't know these things. Why did the U.S. and the Dutch, I think, stop or back out of Arctic drilling? That was odd. Okay, but it's got something to do with them knowing something about climate change, I think. Again, not as conspiracy, but I just don't know. And so, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for coming.
So we're approaching the end of the time. So what we might do is be able to also, if you want to have informal conversations with Professor Vaughn afterwards, but let us thank her for coming to Berkeley and for giving her
Thanks for having me.
Can I offer this to you? Sure. My organization, Reinvigorate, that was in 2014.